Spain just slammed shut the one open door between Europe and Africa. In late July, more than 70,000 people surged towards Ceuta, Spain's tiny territory on Morocco's coast, and at least 90 never made it across alive. Unions had warned Madrid this crush was coming. Now Spain has welded on a new sea barrier, flown in 500 extra police, and vowed the lockdown stays as long as it takes. So here's the question hanging over Ceuta tonight. Did Spain just seal its border forever? That question didn't come out of nowhere. Months before the crush hit the fence, the people who guard it for a living were sounding the alarm. Border worker unions in Ceuta had formally warned Madrid that crossings were climbing steadily and that staffing and infrastructure weren't built for the load heading their way. The CSF and UGT unions filed formal complaints in March, citing a 40% rise in attempted crossings compared to the previous year. These weren't outside critics. These were officers standing at that fence every shift, watching the numbers rise before Madrid looked at a chart. Madrid had that warning in writing. Madrid did not act on it in time. The unions pointed to something more specific too, a legal loophole around migrants arriving by sea rather than by land. Spanish procedure had long treated the two differently, and that gap meant boat arrivals could slip through channels never built to handle this route at this scale. Land crossings hit a hardened fence and an immediate document check. Sea arrivals landed in softer rules and slower removals, a seam in the system rather than a wall. Under a 2019 Interior Ministry directive, land arrivals faced deportation within 72 hours, while sea arrivals could wait weeks in reception centers before any ruling. It is one thing to warn a government that more people are coming. It is another to hand it the exact weak point where the pressure would break through first. Spain had both warnings on file for months and closed neither the staffing gap nor the legal seam before the surge arrived. Warnings like that rarely come with an easy fix, and this one didn't either. Closing the gap meant funded positions, new infrastructure, budget lines that take months to move through any government juggling dozens of other priorities. One internal budget request, filed in April, asked for 12 million euros and 200 new positions. By July, only a third of that had been approved. That is not an excuse for what came next. It is simply the reason a warning filed in writing does not always turn into action in time. Before late July, Ceuta functioned the way small border territories usually do. A steady trickle of regulated crossings, a fence system tested but never overwhelmed, life ordinary enough that most of Spain rarely thought about it. Ceuta covers just 7.8 square miles and counts roughly 84,000 residents, meaning the week's arrivals equaled nearly its entire population. That is the baseline. The surge blew past in days. Then the warning became a headline. In the final days of July, the door didn't creak open. It blew off its hinges. More than 70,000 people moved toward or into Ceuta from Morocco within days, a number so large it dwarfs the enclave's population several times over. Spanish Interior Ministry logs counted 71,400 attempted crossings between July 24th and July 31st alone, more than the entire previous year combined. Ceuta is a strip of Spanish land wedged onto Morocco's Mediterranean coast, small enough to walk end to end in an afternoon, ringed by a border fence system built to process ordinary daily crossings, not a flood this size arriving all at once. Ceuta sits at one end of the Western Mediterranean migration route, one of the main corridors people from West and Central Africa use to reach Europe. The route gained prominence after 2018 as the Central Mediterranean crossing toward Italy grew deadlier, pushing traffic west toward the Strait of Gibraltar's narrow gap. Unlike the longer boat crossings toward Italy or Greece, this route offers something rare, an actual land border you can walk to and climb, no vessel required once you reach the fence. That is what makes Ceuta different from almost every other European entry point, and what made a surge this size physically possible within days. It got that flood anyway. People came by beach, by breakwater at low tide, and by fence, faster than any staffing plan could absorb. Officers who normally processed a trickle of arrivals across a shift were suddenly facing thousands within hours, with no reinforcements in place and no legal fix behind them. The exact scenario the unions had described was now playing out in real time. Crowds pressed along the water, officers outnumbered by ratios nobody had planned for. A flood that people didn't survive crossing. At least 90 died trying to make it. In the water, at the fences, in the crush of bodies pressing toward a border never built to absorb this many people at once. Some drowned in the strait attempting the swim. Some were crushed against barriers they were trying to climb, in a crowd moving faster than any single person could control. Spanish Red Cross volunteers recorded 61 drowning deaths and 29 fatalities at the fence line itself, according to the tally released August 3rd. 90 is not a statistic here. It is the physical cost of a gap. 2 separate warnings had already flagged, and nobody closed in time. Among those who didn't make it were people who had already survived the earlier, dangerous legs of the journey just to reach Morocco's coast. One 19-year-old from Guinea, identified only by his first name Ibrahim, had already crossed 3 borders and outrun militia checkpoints before drowning within sight of Ceuta's shore. The Ceuta crossing was supposed to be close to the finish line, not another place to die within sight of it. Search teams worked the water for days after the crowds thinned, recovering bodies long after the news cameras had moved on. 90 confirmed deaths is a toll rarely seen on this stretch of coastline, and it turned Ceuta overnight from a policy debate into a body count. That is the debt, the ignored warnings left behind, paid in the worst currency there is. So Spain answered that debt the only way it had left. It changed the locks. The first answer sat in the water itself, exactly where the unions had said the weak point was. Madrid installed a new maritime barrier at Ceuta, engineered to choke off the sea route, flagged as the loophole all along. Land crossings already faced a hardened, multi-layer fence system. Now the water route was getting the same treatment for the first time. Land fences have gone up across several European borders over the past decade. But a sea barrier engineered specifically to stop mass foot and swim crossings is a newer, more aggressive tool. It marks Spain treating the water itself as part of the perimeter, not just the beach or fence line behind it. Barriers like this typically combine floating buoy lines with anti-swim netting, an obstacle difficult to defeat without specialized equipment and nearly impossible to cross quickly as part of a crowd. It will not stop every boat that tries. It is built to stop the kind of improvised, mass, on-foot crossing that just killed 90 people. If people couldn't be stopped at the legal level fast enough, they would now be stopped at the waterline before they ever reached the sand. A barrier alone doesn't hold a border, though, so Spain backed it with bodies on the ground. More than 500 additional police officers were deployed to Ceuta, on top of what was already stationed there, pushing the total security presence above 1,600 officers, guarding a territory small enough to cross on foot in under 2 hours. The reinforcements combined national police units with the Guardia Civil, which already handles much of Spain's coastal and border security. The Guardia Civil contingent included 340 officers from its rapid reaction GRS units, flown in from bases in Madrid and Seville within 96 hours of the order. Stacking that many extra officers into so small a territory means more patrols, more checkpoints, and far less room for a crowd to build unnoticed the way one did in late July. Few places in Europe carry that density of security personnel relative to their size. Closer to a fortified checkpoint than an ordinary city border post. An open-ended deployment comes with an open-ended bill too. Salaries, equipment, logistics, all recurring for as long as officials keep renewing the order. Spain effectively committed to funding a fortress-level presence in a 7-square-mile territory indefinitely, a bet that the threat justifies the ongoing cost. This was not sold to the public as a temporary surge. Spanish officials announced the reinforcements would remain in place for as long as necessary. No set end date, no promise of a drawdown once the cameras moved on. That single line turned what looked like an emergency response into something closer to the new permanent baseline for how Ceuta gets policed. The decision split opinion inside Spain almost immediately. Critics on one side argued the government was finally taking border security seriously after years of drift. Critics on the other argued a permanent security buildup in one small enclave sets a troubling precedent for how the country treats people fleeing hardship broadly. Madrid pressed ahead regardless, treating the criticism as the cost of finally doing something concrete. The locks changed on paper too, not just on the ground. Spain announced that migrants who entered irregularly during the surge would not be allowed to remain, would not receive legal status, and would not be permitted to travel onward to mainland Spain, where different procedures and slower removals have historically made deportation far harder to carry out. The measure covers an estimated 14,000 arrivals logged since July 24th. The exceptions are narrow, extreme vulnerability, or a legitimate, provable claim to international protection. Everyone who doesn't clear that bar faces return to Morocco under arrangements the two governments already have in place. That is the second half of the new locks, the paperwork half, and it closes the path just as firmly as the barrier now sitting in the water outside. In practice, extreme vulnerability tends to cover categories like unaccompanied minors, pregnant women, and people with serious medical conditions. The same narrow list international protection frameworks generally recognize. Everyone outside that list is processed as a standard case, no matter what pushed them toward the crossing. Screening those categories falls to Spanish immigration officials and NGO caseworkers inside Ceuta's reception points, working through a backlog that grew by tens of thousands of cases within days. That backlog, more than the barrier or the officer count, is the real bottleneck deciding how long anyone waits behind the new locks. Behind that bottleneck sits a second goal: changing the economics of the crossing itself. If irregular entrants know entering won't lead to legal status or a route onward to mainland Spain, the pitch smugglers make to would-be crossers gets weaker. Spain is betting the deterrent works on the demand side, not just the supply side of fences and patrols. Returning someone to Morocco is not just a policy line. It takes transport, coordination, and Moroccan cooperation, wrapped in its own diplomatic and financial arrangements between Rabat and the EU. Humanitarian groups pushed back almost immediately, warning that fast. Mass returns risk, skipping the individual screening asylum law is supposed to guarantee. Madrid's answer was that the volume itself is the argument. Screen everyone properly or hold the line at the water. It picked holding the line. Locking one door didn't end the pressure building on the frame around it. Messages began circulating on social media calling for a second mass crossing, an attempt to repeat late July's surge before the new defenses could fully settle in. The target was the same stretch of coast, the same fence line, the same opening that had briefly worked once already. This time, security services were watching those channels instead of being caught by them. The first surge happened because nobody read the warning signs in time. The second attempt was stopped because, for once, somebody was reading them. Moroccan authorities intercepted hundreds of people attempting to reach the border before they got close, working the other side of the same door Spain had just reinforced. Moroccan gendarmerie units intercepted 640 people in a single 48-hour sweep around Fnaidek, the town nearest the fence, according to a joint statement issued August 9th. Morocco has its own reasons to want that crossing stopped. From its diplomatic relationship with Madrid to its cooperation arrangements with the EU on migration control. A crisis that started as Spain's problem alone was now being managed jointly. On both sides of a line, both governments suddenly had strong reasons to hold shut. The locks were holding on the ground, but the argument over who owns the door was heating up alongside them. Morocco again raised its long-standing claim to sovereignty over Ceuta and Melilla, reviving a dispute that predates this crisis by generations and never really disappears. It just goes quiet between flashpoints. Spain has held Ceuta for centuries. Morocco has pressed its claim since independence, and the two positions have never moved an inch toward each other. Morocco last formally raised the claim at the United Nations in 1975, the same year it organized the Green March into Western Sahara, and has repeated it roughly once a decade since. Inside Morocco, that claim plays differently than it does in Madrid. Raising the sovereignty question in the middle of a security crisis, it is actively helping contain sends two messages at once: cooperation on migration for Brussels and Madrid to see, and a reminder to its own public that the territorial question hasn't gone away. Under Spain's constitution, Ceuta and Melilla are autonomous cities of Spain, represented in the national parliament like any other Spanish territory. Morocco has never accepted that framing, treating both cities as unfinished business from an earlier era. a claim that resurfaces almost every time relations between the two governments turn tense, exactly as they are now. Spain answered without hesitation. Madrid declared Ceuta and Melilla unquestionably Spanish territory. Full stop. No room for negotiation, no matter how the migration numbers or diplomatic pressure shift in the weeks ahead. What began as a border management crisis had turned into a sovereignty standoff, playing out over the exact stretch of fence and sea where people had died only weeks earlier. That standoff matters beyond Spain and Morocco, because Ceuta and Melilla are the European Union's only physical land borders with Africa. Poland's border with Belarus and Greece's with Turkey draw more headlines, but neither is an actual walkable land seam between continents. Ceuta is the only one of its kind. Exactly why what Spain does here tends to become the template other EU governments watch closely. Changed locks don't erase what's already inside the house, though. An estimated 5,000 to 8,000 migrants remain in Ceuta, still waiting to find out what happens to them under the new rules. Hundreds have taken to demonstrating near reception points, demanding asylum rather than a return to Morocco they don't accept as fair or final. Demonstrators point to overcrowded reception conditions as part of their case, arguing that people who survive the crossing deserve a real hearing rather than an expedited form. Authorities have held their position regardless, processing cases under the new rules instead of carving out exceptions under pressure from the protests. Local services in a territory that's small were never built to hold a surge this large for this long. Housing, food distribution, and medical care are all strained by thousands of extra people with nowhere confirmed to go and no fast resolution in sight. Schools and clinics built for a small enclave's ordinary population are now absorbing a crowd many times their planned capacity. The barrier stopped new arrivals from the sea. It did nothing for the people already standing on the other side of it. No public timeline exists for resolving the cases of those still waiting, and the new rules don't say how quickly a claim of extreme vulnerability gets decided. Until that machinery catches up, thousands remain in limbo behind a border that has otherwise been sealed shut. European capitals well beyond Madrid are watching how this plays out, because Ceuta is effectively a live test of whether barriers, extra police, and hardline legal rules can hold when arrivals spike far past any contingency plan. If the approach works here, expect the same playbook pitched at other pressure points around Europe's edges. If it doesn't, or if the human cost keeps mounting the way it did in late July, the pressure shifts to Brussels to find an answer that isn't just more fencing. What none of that settles is whether any of this is temporary. Ceuta sits as one of the European Union's only actual land borders with Africa, a narrow physical seam between two continents that almost nowhere else in Europe has to defend in person, fence to fence, water to water. Spain now has to decide whether the last few weeks were an emergency lockdown, it eventually eases once the pressure fades, or the permanent shape of how it guards that seam going forward. Spain sealed THE door, not THE crisis. The barrier stops boats, the extra officers stop crossings, and the new paperwork rules stop asylum claims from irregular entrance. But none of it stops the pressure still building on the other side of that fence, and none of it answers the sovereignty question Morocco just reopened. Spain changed the locks. Whether that turns out to be a temporary fix or the new permanent shape of Europe's edge with Africa is still an open question. Do you think this is a short-term emergency response? Or has Spain just set the permanent rules for this border? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more stories like this, like and subscribe.